Welcome to Unit 4. And in this unit, we want to have a discussion about money, as well as the role that central banks play within the economy. So let's begin our discussion by speaking about exactly what is money, or by defining money. So in terms of a definition, money is a medium of exchange. And it's a medium of exchange that allows us to purchase goods and services. And it's also a medium of exchange that allows us to service debt obligations. So if we have loans, then this money allows us to service these debts. Now, given that money is a medium of exchange, then it means that there are some properties or characteristics that money need to have if it's to function in this capacity. So we're now going to look at the characteristics of money. So one of the properties that money should have is that it should be scarce. And it should be scarce because if everybody can go and get access to this resource, then what it means is that it would not be able to keep value. So it has to be scarce. Secondly, money has to be acceptable, meaning there has to be a general consensus within the environment that this is going to be accepted as a token that will facilitate the medium of exchange. 3, money has to be durable. So if you will go back to what used to happen in the olden days, we used to have what is known as a barter system, whereby persons would use their goods or their services to exchange for other goods and services. So let's say, for example, that apples are going to be used to facilitate the exchange. The issue with apples is that they deteriorate over time, so they don't last very long. So it's not like you're able to use this apple to store value for long periods of time. Therefore, money has to be durable. It has to be able to last for long periods of time. Which brings us to the other property of money, in that it must be stable. And by being stable, we are simply saying that the money is able to hold value. So durable, lasts long, and stable, it holds value. Another essential property of money is that it should be portable. So we should be able to transport it easily to facilitate that exchange when necessary. And the other property that I want to mention quickly is that money should also be divisible. So there should be different units which are available to facilitate this exchange that is possible. So these are some of the characteristics of money. Should be scarce, acceptable, durable, stable, portable, and divisible. And this now easily allows us to transition into looking at the functions of money. So given that we know the characteristics, then what role does money play within the environment? And as we would have mentioned earlier, one of the things is that it is a medium of exchange. So we can use it to purchase goods and services in a convenient manner. Two, it allows us to measure value. So it supports the measurement of value. In other words, we are able to quantify value by virtue of looking at money. So, for example, a BMW is going to cost more than a Honda, for example. And because it costs more, then it intrinsically tells us something about the value of the BMW, about the quality of the BMW, etc. And of course, we're talking in general terminologies, right? The other function of money is that we want it to store value over time. And as we mentioned when we spoke about durability and stability, this is an essential function of money. It should be able to hold the value over time. So hold value for 20 years or 30 years without being devalued. And of course, we know that inflation plays a role within the society, and inflation and so on will cause a depreciation in the money. But in general terms, we're saying that we want to have something representing money that can hold on to values. And I think the final or the fourth thing to mention here when we're talking about the function of money is that it facilitates um, deferred payments. So deferred or future payments. So it facilitates this. In other words, we can get the benefit of the thing today, but we pay for it in the future. And money allows us to facilitate this. So we say we buy now, but we pay later. And that is the whole essence of deferred payment. Now, given that we have looked at what is money, what are the characteristics of money, and what are the functions of money, then I think it bears, it is essential for us to sort of distinguish between the different types of money that have been used. And the two primary ones is that we have used commodities to represent money. And when we talk about commodities, we're really talking about tangible assets which have intrinsic value. Now, these commodities, they have to satisfy the characteristics of, of money. So, for example, let's look at something like silver, so precious metals. It's tangible, it is scarce, it is relatively durable, it is stable, but it has intrinsic value. So, for example, we can use the silver to make jewelry, and we can use it to make utensils or to make weapons, etc. So we can use these commodities as tokens to represent money. So that's one thing that we can use. But then there is the concept that is being used within our societies, which is known as fiat money. And this is money that is really not backed by anything that is tangible. So it's not backed by a tangible resource or asset. In other words, fiat money is just a concept. And what we have done with this concept is we come up with legal tender with these notes and these coins, and we use them to represent value within a society. Now, in and of itself, these legal tender, they really don't have any intrinsic value. Back in the days, we used to have like gold. So every token, every money that you had was actually backed by an equivalent value in terms of gold, which was stored at the central repositories or the banks. The challenge with that, though, is that, to store gold, it's going to take up a whole lot of space, etc., etc., etc. Therefore, this concept of fiat money allows us to facilitate this exchange in a more optimal manner. So we have looked at what money is, we have looked at characteristics, we have looked at functions, we have defined the two common types of tokens that have been used to represent money, meaning commodities, and fiat money. So we are now at the point where we want to have a discussion as to why do we want to hold on to money? So why hold money? In other words, we work, we earn incomes, and this income is paid out in terms of money. But we are going to want to hold on to some of that money, whether through savings or whatever other instruments might be available. And the question is, why would we want to do this? And this leads us to the transactionary, the precautionary, and the speculative motives of money. So first of all, we hold on to money because we want to do transactions, financial transactions. For example, we want to pay our bills. Okay, so we want to pay our bills so that we can live. We want to purchase food, etc. So we hold on to this money out of whatever income we have generated so that we can facilitate these regular transactions that we need to perform to ensure that we are able to sustain ourselves. So that's one. Secondly, we can use it as a precaution. So for example, we might store money in reserves for emergency purposes. So we store the money because we are saying that we might get ill and we might need to draw on this reserve so that we can get the medical attention that we need or whatever other emergency considerations that can come up in everyday life. So we hold on to the money as a precaution. And three, we talk about the speculative motive for holding on to money. And when we're talking about speculation, we're really talking about short-term gains. So we are holding on to the money because we want to try and take advantage of short-term gains. And I think it makes sense for us now to just briefly talk about bonds. Going to talk about bonds versus stocks. So these are financial instruments, bonds versus stocks. So when we talk about stock, we're talking about some ownership stake. So some ownership stake in a company. So the company will offer stocks up for sale because they want to get an infusion of cash so that they can do things within the organization. And by purchasing these stocks, we're actually buying a piece of the company. So we're owning a piece of the company. And this comes with risk and it comes with rewards. So it comes with risk and it comes with rewards. Typically, what happens is that we are paid dividends on a timely basis. It could be every 6 months, it could be every year. And these dividends are paid out whenever profits are made by the company. Then there's something that is known as capital gains. In other words, the price of the stock might rise. So we buy the stock for $100 per stock, but over time it moves to $500. So what we can do at that point is we can sell the stock and we gain on the margins based on what we bought it for and what we can sell it for. So we can obtain capital gains on the stock. And this can be very lucrative. The challenge, though, is because we have bought an ownership stake in the company, then whenever there are losses, then we incur all of the losses. So we incur all losses. So if the company goes belly up, it fails. Then all of this money that we would have invested in the stock is actually lost. On the other hand, when we think about a bond, we're thinking about an instrument that is a little bit more secure. So it's a little bit more secure than stocks. So what typically happens is that there will be some rate of return, some interest that is stipulated at the point when we purchase the bonds. And we are given some sort of term limit for it to mature. Let's say we take it, we're going to get a 10% return, but we must hold this for 5 years. Then at the end of the 5 years, we would get back the money that we have invested in terms of purchasing the bond, but would also get that 5% rate of return as well. And these are typically thought to be more secure from the standpoint that there is a contractual obligation. So there's a contractual obligation on behalf of the person who is issuing the bonds or selling the bonds. And typically what we find is that governments use this kind of instrument a lot of times, and governments are usually, stable. They usually are able to satisfy the contractual arrangements that they have made. All right, so going back to the whole issue of speculative, we're saying that when we're talking about speculation, we're talking about taking advantage of short-term gains. So, for example, we could go and we could purchase some stocks in the short term because we are anticipating that the value of the stock is going to rise. And then when the stock rises, we sell it and we capture that margin, as I mentioned earlier. We could also look at other kinds of, and I'm calling them investments, like this, where we put in some money into some of these vehicles So I'm putting investment here in double quotes. Because typically when we talk about investment, we're talking about um, long-term prospects. But in speculation, we're talking about short-term gains. Let me just write this a bit properly. All right, so that looks a little bit better. And then I now have the double quotes. So we're really talking about short-term gains when we're talking about speculation. And we either want to take advantage of these short-term gains or we want to avoid losses. So these are the two primary reasons that drive speculation. We want to avoid loss. All right, so I think this gives us a good basis in terms of understanding what money is, what is its role and function, and why we would want to hold on to money based on the transactionary nature, the precautionary nature, and the speculative nature. And in the next session, we're going to be looking at the role of the central bank and how it can impact monetary policies and impact inflation within the economy. And we're also going to talk about the whole concept of the money multiplier, what it means, how to do a brief calculation using that concept. So take care and see you in the next lecture.